Her father had worked the quarries near Stavanger before they emigrated. She was 7 years old the first time he took her down into a spring pit dug into granite. October wind cut through her dress, numbing her fingers, stiffening the grass above. But when her father crouched beside the damp stone wall and pressed his palm flat against it, the cold was different, steady, almost warm compared to the air above. Below the frost line, he told her, weather has to ask permission. She had not thought about that lesson in 20 years. Now standing at the edge of a dry well on the Dakota prairie with 2 children and no husband, she needed weather to ask permission, because if it did not, they would not see spring. She had arrived in Kingsbury County in August of 1887 with a husband who could lift a plow blade with one arm. By June, she was burying him in ground that had not yet seen a full year of their labor. The wagon overturned on the road from town. Green lumber shifted. The axle snapped. Nels Vangen lived long enough to be carried home, but not long enough to see what he had built completed. Maren Halvorsdatter. Vangen stood at the graveside with her daughter Kirsten, age 7, and her son Eric, age 4. The minister spoke words she could not hear over the wind. What she heard instead was arithmetic. $18 remained after burial and freight accounts. 6 acres broken, 1 milk cow. A hog lot too thin to survive a hard winter. A house with a roof that leaked above the bed. And a dry well that had never given water. She could not leave. The claim required 5 years of continuous residence. Walking away meant forfeiting everything Nels had paid with his body. Walking away meant returning to nothing. No family in Minnesota who could take 3 more mouths, no passage money for the return to Norway, no charity waiting in any direction she might walk. She had until November to prepare for her first Dakota winter alone. She had never preserved meat at scale. She had never stacked more than a handful of firewood. She had 2 children who would need protein every week from first freeze to spring thaw, and she had no way to give it to them. The first visitor came 3 days after the burial. August Tollefson stepped down from his freight wagon with the air of a man who had already made his assessment from the road. He was 58 years old. He had crossed 6 Dakota winters hauling supplies between Brookings and De Smet. He had seen what happened to families who miscalculated. He walked the property without asking permission. He tested the door frame. He looked at the woodpile. He paced the distance from the house to the animal shelter Nels had started but never finished. When he returned to where Maren stood, his face held no cruelty, only the certainty of a man delivering a verdict. "You have 1 roof leak above the bed," August said. "You have maybe 1.5 cords fit to burn. You need 6 minimum." He gestured toward the open prairie. "No smokehouse, no cellar worth naming. 1 cow that will need feed you cannot afford." Maren said nothing. "How much meat do you expect to preserve?" August asked. 300 pounds, Maren said. "Finished weight, venison, pork, fish." August did not laugh. That would have been kinder. "If you trust children to that hope," he said, "they will eat smoke in November and snow in January." He climbed back onto his wagon. Before he lifted the reins, he turned back. "I have seen women prove up claims alone, but not women who start a winter with nothing and no one." He paused. "Sell now. You might get $40 for the improvements, enough for a train ticket somewhere." He drove away. Maren stood in the yard until his wagon disappeared over the rise. Then she walked to the dry well at the edge of the broken ground. The shaft dropped 20 feet into darkness. Nels had dug it in the spring, hoping for water. The water had never come. He had lined the upper portion with fieldstone and packed the seams with clay, then abandoned it when the digging revealed only dry earth. She had planned to fill it in. The children could fall. But standing at the rim in the afternoon heat, she noticed something strange. The air rising from the shaft was cool. Not cold. The August sun made cold impossible, but cooler than the yard. Cooler than the air that pressed against her neck. She dropped a tin cup on a rope and lowered it 10 feet. When she pulled it up, the metal was cold against her palm. The well had failed at its purpose. But the well had a property she had not considered. Underground kept its own temperature. The memory came that night while she lay awake listening to Eric breathe. Her father, Halvor, had worked the quarries near Stavanger before emigrating. He had shown her something once when she was small, the inside of a spring pit dug into granite. October wind had cut through her dress. But when her father placed his palm against the damp stone inside the pit, the cold was different, steady, unmoved by the weather above. Below the frost line, he had told her, weather has to ask permission. She had not thought about that lesson in 20 years. Now it returned with the weight of something that mattered. A proper smokehouse would require lumber she could not afford, labor she could not provide, and time she did not have. Salting alone would require barrels and quantities of salt beyond her means. Dependence on the railroad meant dependence on weather that could stop freight for weeks, leaving families to grind emergency grain while children weakened. But if the well stayed cool through summer heat, what would it do through autumn? She began to think about vertical space. Upper depths for drying, lower depths for storage. A shaft that breathed could circulate smoke without the fire danger of a surface structure. The stone lining would hold temperature better than any wooden walls she could build in 3 months. The idea was not genius. It was desperation looking for geometry. 3 methods combined into one structure: salt to draw moisture, smoke to preserve and deter insects, underground storage to shield food from the killing swings between thaw and freeze. None of these ideas were new. Norwegian farmers had used cool cellars for generations. Smokehouse logic was as old as meat, but no one Maren knew had tried to combine them in a dry well. If she overheated the shaft, the fat would turn rancid. If she trapped too much moisture, mold would claim everything. If the well breathed badly, smoke would stagnate and bitter the meat with creosote. If August Tollefson was right, she would waste the entire autumn on a gamble while her children grew thinner. She got out of bed before dawn and began drawing plans in the dirt. Ruth Beck arrived on the 4th day of August. She was the nearest neighbor, nearly 2 miles by wagon track, a 30-minute walk across open prairie. Her husband Johannes had a proper smokehouse, built with lumber from Minnesota before the prices rose. Ruth was practical, capable, and not inclined toward cruelty. She had brought bread. "I heard about Nels," Ruth said. "The whole county heard." She looked at the half-finished animal shelter, the thin woodpile, the dry well with rope coiled beside it. "What are you planning?" Maren showed her. Ruth looked down the shaft for a long moment. When she looked up, her face held the expression of someone who did not want to deliver bad news to a grieving woman. "Underground means damp," Ruth said, "and damp means rot." "Not if the air moves," Maren said. "You can't know that. I can test it." Ruth shook her head. "Why would you put winter meat where potatoes sweat? Every cellar I've ever seen grows mold on the walls by October." "A cellar has one opening," Maren said. "This shaft is narrow and deep. The air pulls differently." "You don't know that either." Maren did not argue. Argument would prove nothing. Instead, she cut 2 identical strips of pork from the small piece Ruth had brought as charity. She hung one in the attic, above the stove heat but away from direct sun. She hung the other on a rope 7 feet down the well shaft, where the air stayed cooler. "Come back in 1 week," Maren said. "We'll weigh them both." Ruth left without agreeing, but she came back. 7 days later, the attic strip had drawn flies. The surface showed the green beginning of spoilage. Maren cut away the damaged portion and weighed what remained. The well strip was darker, drier. The surface showed no flies, no mold, no slick shine of rot. When she pressed her thumb against the meat, it resisted. When she smelled it, the scent was salt and iron, not decay. Ruth said nothing for a long moment. "1 strip is not 300 pounds. she finally said. No, Marin agreed, but one strip is proof enough to continue. The news traveled faster than Marin expected. By the third week of August, 3 separate households had heard some version of the story. The Vangen widow was curing meat in the dry well. The version grew stranger with each telling. By the time it reached Silas Prune's store in De Smet, the story had become something grotesque. Silas was 43, unmarried, and prosperous in the particular way that storekeepers became prosperous on the frontier, by extending credit to desperate families and collecting when they could not pay. He had carried Marin's account since June. He had carried it patiently, knowing that patience was profitable when claim failures were involved. He had assumed he would own her quarter by spring. The day Marin came to buy salt, the store was full. "The widow Vangen," Silas said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Come to buy more salt for the meat grave." The men at the counter laughed. 2 women near the fabric bolts did not laugh, but they did not defend her either. "What did you call it?" Marin asked. "The meat grave." Silas smiled. "That's what folks are calling it. You put food down a hole, you're burying it. Might as well say a prayer while you lower the rope." Marin felt heat rise to her face, but she had learned something from her father that Silas had not. Shame was a luxury. She could not afford luxuries. "How much for 10 pounds of salt?" she asked. Silas named a price. It was half again what the salt had cost in July. "That seems high," Marin said. "Supply and demand." Silas spread his hands. "Everybody wants salt in August, and you need more than most, it seems. All that meat to bury." The room waited. Marin reached into her dress pocket and pulled out coins. She counted them onto the counter, the exact amount Silas had named. 10 pounds, she said, and a spool of butcher's twine. Silas had expected her to argue. He had expected her to plead for credit extension. The coins on the counter, coins she was not supposed to have, shifted something in his expression. He filled the order in silence. As Marin lifted the salt bag, she turned to face the room. "When February comes," she said, "I will remember who laughed." She walked out into the August sunlight. Behind her, Silas Prune began calculating how much harder he would need to squeeze. If you've ever been doubted by someone who didn't understand what you were building, tell us about it in the comments. And stay with this story, because what happens next to Marin is something nobody in that room expected. The mentor arrived by accident. Doctor. Elias Finch was 63 years old, widowed 2 winters earlier in Minnesota, and traveling west for reasons he did not explain. He had served as a contract surgeon for the Army during the war, and had spent the decades since collecting specimens, recording temperatures, and asking questions that most people considered eccentric. He stopped at the Vangen claim in early September because he heard Eric coughing from the road. Marin answered the door with a rifle. "I'm a doctor," Finch said. He held up his hands, showing empty palms and a leather medical bag. "Your boy has a cough that carries. I can help if you allow it." Marin hesitated. She had not seen a doctor since leaving Minnesota. She had not expected to see one on the prairie, but Eric's cough had worsened, and the rifle would not treat bronchitis. She lowered the weapon and stepped aside. Finch examined the boy with gentle efficiency. He listened to Eric's chest. He looked at his tongue. He asked Marin questions about the boy's diet, his sleep, his activities. "Dust and dry air," Finch concluded. "Not consumption, but he needs moisture in what he breathes and better food in what he eats." He looked around the small house. "You're alone here?" "My husband died in June." Finch nodded slowly. He did not offer condolences. He seemed to understand that condolences had become meaningless. "I noticed the well on my way in," he said. "The rope arrangement, the pulley. That's not a water rig." Marin considered lying, but there was something in the old man's eyes, a curiosity that seemed detached from judgment. "I'm preserving meat in the shaft," she said. "Salt cured, then smoked." Finch raised his eyebrows. "In the well?" "The temperature holds steadier than any structure I could build. If I can control the airflow, I can control the cure." She expected him to dismiss her. She expected the same look Ruth had given, the same condescension Silas had offered. Instead, Finch set down his medical bag. "Show me," he said. They stood at the mouth of the well while the September sun fell toward the western hills. Finch looked at her test strips. He examined the rope arrangement, the clay-packed walls, the narrow shaft dropping into darkness. He lowered himself to his knees and held his palm over the opening, feeling the air that rose from below. "You have convection," he said. "The shaft breathes. Warm air rises, cool air settles, and the difference creates movement." He sat back on his heels. "But you can't see where the flow stalls. You can't see where smoke accumulates instead of passing through." "How would I see that?" Finch smiled. It was the first time Marin had seen him smile. "Candle test," he said. "We lower a flame and watch. Where the flame bends, air moves. Where the flame stands straight, air stagnates. You adjust the vents until the whole shaft pulls evenly." He reached into his coat and produced a stub of tallow candle. "May I?" Marin nodded. They lowered the candle on a thin rope, watching the flame through the gathering dusk. At 5 feet, it bent slightly east. At 10 feet, it steadied. At 15 feet, it began to flicker, pulling toward the west wall. "There," Finch said. "At 15 feet, you have uneven flow. The west wall holds moisture, probably from seep through the clay packing. If you smoke there, the residue will collect instead of venting. That's where creosote builds. That's where meat goes bitter." Marin stared at him. "How do you know this?" "I don't know meat curing," Finch admitted, "but I know air. I spent 3 years studying mine ventilation during the war. Shaft dynamics, temperature gradients. The principles are the same whether you're moving coal smoke or beef smoke." He pulled the candle up and pinched the flame between his fingers. "Your idea has merit, but you need to understand the physics, not just guess at them." "Will you teach me?" Finch considered the question. He looked at the small house, the thin woodpile, the children's faces in the window. "I will stay through October," he said. "After that, I travel south." "Why would you help?" Finch picked up his medical bag and turned toward the road where his horse waited. "Because you kept records," he said. "The test strips, the weights, the dates you wrote on the wall. Most people guess. You measure." He glanced back at her. "I spent my life surrounded by people who believe without evidence. It is pleasant to meet someone who tests before trusting." He walked to his horse. "I'll return in 2 days with instruments. We have work to do." The work was brutal. Marin deepened the shaft 2 additional feet, hauling buckets of earth up the pulley while Finch watched and recorded. She repacked the loose seams with fresh clay, sealing the places where moisture crept through. She fitted a crossbeam over the mouth, reinforcing the pulley with wagon hardware she could not afford to replace. Finch taught her things she had never considered. Salt discipline, weak brine quartz, spoilage. Every batch needed consistent salinity, measured by floating an egg until it rose to the proper height. Uneven salting created pockets of moisture that rotted from within while the surface stayed dry. Contamination prevention, scald hooks, cloth, and knives between batches. Keep finished meat separated from fresh blood. The practices seemed extreme. Most neighbors butchered with whatever blade was handy, but Finch insisted they mattered. "Spoilage is invisible until it isn't," he said. "By the time you smell it, you've already lost." Temperature reading, The mercury thermometer Finch carried was worth more than everything Marin owned. He taught her to lower it on a cord and read the marks through a magnifying lens. The well's lower depths held at roughly 42 degrees even when the surface air climbed into the 60s. That steadiness was the entire foundation. She built shelves at 3 levels: upper for newly smoked meat that needed final drying, middle for transition, lower for finished storage where temperature mattered most. She constructed a lid from cottonwood planks with a tar paper skin, insulated with straw and hay against the coming cold. The smoking pot took longest. She shaped it from clay over 3 days, forming a vessel the size of a wash boiler with a vent collar that could be adjusted by rotating an iron ring. The grate she scavenged from her broken stove, the piece Nels had meant to repair before the wagon trip that killed him. Progress markers accumulated. By mid-September, she had cured and smoked the first deer, venison from her cousin's hunt, promised in exchange for labor she could not provide. By late September, she had processed the first hog, smaller than she'd hoped, but yielding 43 pounds of finished meat after smoking. By the first week of October, the total stood at 97 pounds, less than a third of what she needed. And the season was closing. The pulley pin sheared on the 9th of October. Marin was lowering a batch of fish, pike and perch split for smoking, when the iron gave way. The rope went slack. The basket dropped 15 feet and shattered against the clay floor of the shaft. She spent 6 hours recovering the fish, climbing down a rope ladder Finch rigged from harness leather. 3 of the pike were damaged beyond use. The rest she cleaned, resalted, and hung to try again. The replacement pin cost 70 cents. She had $14 remaining. A warm spell hit mid-October. 4 days of unseasonable heat that made the upper shaft sweat. 1 batch of pork turned tacky, the fat softening into something that would not keep. She cut away the damaged portions and noted what remained. 31 pounds lost. Eric fell from the woodpile on the 17th. His ankle swelled purple. For 3 days, Marin carried him everywhere while trying to work. Her back seized on the 4th day. She crawled to the well and pulled herself up the pulley rope to haul the morning batch. The second hog was lighter than expected. 40 pounds dressed, barely half what she had counted on. October ended with 182 pounds finished and stored. She needed at least 300 to stretch through winter with any safety margin. She was short by more than a third. And the first real snow came on November 3rd. Finch found her sitting at the well mouth, staring into darkness. "You're behind," he said. "I know. You have perhaps 3 weeks before the shaft becomes too cold to smoke efficiently. After that, you can store what you have, but you cannot add to it." Marin said nothing. Finch sat down beside her. His joints creaked. He was not built for Dakota weather, and both of them knew he would leave soon. "The venison Halverson promised," he said. "Has it arrived?" "Tomorrow. 2 deer. Maybe 3. If 3, and if you work without sleep, you might reach 250 pounds, perhaps 260. It's not enough. It is more than most families in this county will have." Finch looked out over the snow-dusted prairie. "Survival is not a number, Marin. It is a series of adjustments. 250 pounds with discipline will outlast 300 pounds with waste. My children will be hungry." "Your children will be alive." Marin pulled her coat tighter. The cold was not bitter yet, nothing like what January would bring, but she could feel the season turning. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees in the past week. The shaft reading showed 41 degrees at the lowest shelf. Still workable, but closing. "When do you leave?" she asked. "The 12th. I have obligations in Kansas before the new year." 9 days. 9 days to finish what she had started. 9 days with the only person who had believed her idea could work, then alone until spring. Will you help me process the venison? She asked. Finch stood. His knees popped. I would not miss it, he said. But after the 12th, what you do with this shaft is yours alone. I cannot carry the knowledge for you. I can only help you find it. He walked back toward the house, where Kirsten was minding the stove, and Eric was reading his primer with his swollen foot propped on a pillow. Maren stayed at the well until the cold drove her inside. Tomorrow the deer would arrive. Tomorrow the final sprint would begin. The venison came, 3 deer, not 2. For 6 days, Maren and Finch worked without stopping except for sleep. They butchered by lantern light. They mixed brine in the pre-dawn cold. They lowered batches into the shaft and hauled cured meat up for smoking in rotation. The smoking pot proved its worth. The cold air at depth meant the smoke rose slowly, penetrating deeper into the meat than any surface smokehouse could achieve. The temperature differential pulled the smoke upward through the vent collar, creating a convection that ran constantly without tending. By November 10th, the total reached 231 pounds. By the 11th, 258. On the 12th, the morning Finch was scheduled to leave, Maren pulled the final batch from the shaft. The count stood at 293 pounds of finished preserved meat, 7 pounds short of her target, but closer than anyone had thought possible. Finch loaded his horse in the thin morning light. His medical bag hung from the saddle. His thermometer he left on Maren's table, wrapped in cloth. The instrument is worth more than I should leave behind, he said. But you will need it more than I will. The shaft is your machine now. You must read its temperature like a pulse. I don't know how to thank you. Finch shook his head. You taught yourself. I only helped you see what you were already doing. He climbed stiffly into the saddle. Remember the candle test. Remember the salt discipline. And remember that physics does not care about hope. The shaft will hold if the conditions are right. It will not hold if you pretend the conditions are right when they are not. Will you return? Finch looked east toward Kansas and whatever waited for him there. Perhaps, if the winter does not take me first. He gathered the reins. Survive, Maren. Let that be how you thank me. He rode away. Maren watched until he disappeared over the same rise where August Tollefson had vanished 4 months earlier. Then she turned back to the well. 293 pounds. It would have to be enough. December passed in a slow constriction. The temperature dropped week by week. The shaft readings fell from 41 degrees to 38, then 35. The meat on the lowest shelf showed no degradation. The upper shelves, where the temperature swung more with weather, she monitored daily. Silas Prune's store saw increasing traffic as families realized their preparations had fallen short. Men who had laughed at Maren in August now stood quietly in line to buy whatever salted pork Silas had imported at twice the summer price. Ruth Beck visited in mid-December. She examined the shaft with new eyes. It worked, Ruth said. It was not a question. So far. Johannes says our smokehouse supply will last until March if we're careful, but careful means hungry by February. Maren said nothing. Ruth had not believed. Ruth had asked why anyone would trust potatoes to a well. But Ruth was also a neighbor, and neighbors had buried Nels. If you run short, Maren said, come to me. We will work something out. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. I'm sorry I doubted, she said. Doubt was reasonable. The test was not conducted yet. They shook hands. It was the first time Maren had touched another adult since Finch rode away. January opened with a false warmth. The 12th dawned mild. Maren woke to temperatures that felt like early November, 38 degrees by the thermometer Finch had left. The children were restless. The cow needed walking. The sky seemed impossibly blue. By noon, the blue had turned to white. If you're invested in this story, hit subscribe right now, because what happens in the next 8 hours will determine whether Marin's gamble was genius or tragedy. The front came without warning. One moment the air was still. The next, the wind arrived like a wall, a solid mass of cold that slammed into the house, hard enough to rattle the door in its frame. The temperature did not drop gradually, it plunged. Marin watched Finch's thermometer fall in real time. 28 degrees. 20. 15. The mercury vanished into negative numbers she had never seen before. The sky went white, not cloud white, the white of snow moving horizontally so fast that up and down became meaningless. Visibility dropped to nothing. Marin could not see the animal shelter 30 feet away. She could not see the well. Eric began to cry. "Get under the quilts," Marin told Kirsten. "Both of you, do not leave them until I say." She fought the door open and tied a rope from the latch to her waist. She had prepared this line in November, knowing a storm like this might come. The rope stretched 40 feet, long enough to reach the well's cross beam if she walked straight. The wind hit her like a fist. She could not see. She could not hear anything except the roar. Snow drove into her eyes, her mouth, her coat collar. The cold was immediate and total, not the creeping cold of a long night, but the aggressive cold of something trying to kill her in minutes. She walked blind, counting steps. 10 steps, 20, 30. Her hands found the crossbeam before she saw it. The well lid was buried. 3 inches of snow had accumulated in the past hour, packed hard by wind. She dropped to her knees and clawed the covering away, her fingers going numb inside her mittens. The lid came free. The shaft breathed upward, a column of air warmer than the hell above it. She uncoiled the pulley rope and began lowering herself, rung by rung, into the darkness below. The shaft was calm. That was the first thing she noticed. Above her, the world screamed, but 10 feet down, the sound muted. 15 feet down, it became a distant moan. At the bottom, she could hear her own breathing. The thermometer Finch had taught her to hang at the lowest shelf read 34 degrees, cold, but not killing cold. The walls of field stone and packed clay had held their temperature against the violence above. She lit a stub candle, the same test Finch had taught her, and watched the flame. It bent slightly north. The shaft was still breathing, still pulling air through the vent collar, but the circulation had slowed as the temperature differential increased. She climbed the rough shelves, checking each level. The lowest shelf, hams wrapped in cloth, cool and dry, no sign of spoilage. The middle shelf, smoked fish, darker than when she had stored them, but solid. The upper shelf, the last batch of venison nearly 2 months cured, firm under her thumb. She loaded her sack. 2 hams, a section of pike. Enough for 3 days if she was careful. The children would need protein to fight the cold. Climbing out was harder than descending. Her arms ached. Her fingers would not grip. She pulled herself up the rope, hand over hand, her body screaming, until she reached the cross beam and hauled herself onto the snow-covered ground. The wind had not diminished. She could not see the rope leading back to the house. She grabbed it and pulled herself forward through the white blindness until her shoulder struck the door frame. She fumbled the latch. She fell inside. The children were crying. The fire was dying. Her hands were white, but she had meat. The storm lasted 3 days. On the second day, Kirsten developed fever. Marin held her daughter through the long night, feeding her broth made from smoked ham. The fire consumed wood faster than she had calculated. The wind found every crack in the walls, every gap where Nels's repairs had fallen short. By the morning of the 3rd day, she had burned through half her remaining fuel. She made 2 more trips to the well. Each time, the snow was deeper. Each time, the cold was worse. Each time, The shaft held. On the second descent, she noticed surface bloom on one of the lower bundles, the white fuzz of mold beginning where moisture had collected against the stone wall. She cut away the affected meat and trimmed deep, perhaps a pound and a half lost. The rest was clean. The system was not perfect, but the system was holding. On the afternoon of the third day, Ruth Beck's boy appeared at the door. He was 13 years old. He had walked 2 miles through drifts taller than his waist. His face was white with cold, and his fingers were black at the tips. "Our stores are gone," he said. "Father went to the shelter yesterday and did not come back." Marin pulled him inside. She wrapped him in quilts. She fed him broth from the pot she had kept warm for Kirsten. Then she looked at her remaining meat. If she fed Ruth's family, her own margin would shrink. If she did not, a woman would lose her husband, and a boy would lose his father. She loaded the largest ham she had, wrapped it in cloth, and handed it to the Beck boy. "When you can walk, take this to your mother. Tell her I will come when the wind falls." The boy stayed until evening. When he left, he carried enough protein to feed his family for a week. Marin watched him disappear into the diminishing storm. She was down to 231 pounds. The wind fell on the fourth morning. Marin opened the door to a world transformed. Snow lay in drifts 12 feet high against the windward wall of the house. The animal shelter was buried to the roofline. The sky was blue and utterly still, the cold so intense that her breath crystallized before it left her lips. She checked the well first. The lid had held. The shaft temperature read 31 degrees, colder than before, but still above the freezing point that would damage the stores. Then she saw August Tollefson. He was walking across the snow, moving slowly, his face haggard. He had been trapped somewhere during the storm, caught between his wagon and shelter, forced to dig into a snowbank to survive. He reached the well and stopped. "They told me you were curing meat down there," August said. His voice was hoarse. "In August, I thought you were mad." Marin said nothing. "I ate my emergency stores on the second day." August looked at the shaft, at the pulley, at the rope arrangement that now seemed like the most sensible thing on the prairie. "The family I was sheltering with, the Iversons, they had nothing left. The wife was feeding the children flower water. The husband was talking about slaughtering the horse. And now?" August looked at her. "How much can you spare?" Marin considered. She had 231 pounds. Her children needed 60 pounds minimum to reach spring safely, assuming no more emergencies. Ruth Beck's family needed help. The Iversons needed help. If she gave everything she had, her own children would starve in March. If she gave nothing, her neighbors' children would starve now. She made the calculation her father had taught her. Not generosity, geometry. How many mouths, how many days, how many pounds could be stretched across the county if everyone ate less, but everyone ate something? "Send the Iversons tonight," she said. "I will have what I can spare." August Tollefson looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something Marin had never seen him do. He lowered his head. "I judged wrong," he said. "I judged by the shape of the thing instead of what it could hold." He turned and walked back across the snow, moving faster than when he arrived. Behind him, Marin began the descent into the well. There was portioning to be done, and the light would not last. When the wind finally fell for good, Silas Prune opened his ledger desk in DeSmet. His own store had run short. The imported pork he had marked up in December was gone by January 10th. He had rationed, hoarded, and still found himself staring at empty shelves. He heard the rumors within a day. The Van Gen widow had fed 3 families during the blizzard. The Van Gen widow had meat to spare. The Van Gen widow was portioning stores from a dead well like charity from a pulpit. He made the ride out on January 17th. Maren was at the well when he arrived. She was hauling a wrapped ham for the Sandvig family, whose patriarch had lost both feet to frostbite during the storm. "Mrs. Vangen," Silas said. Maren looked up. Her face showed nothing. "I came to discuss your account," Silas said. "You still owe for the salt and the twine. I have $4 remaining. The account stands at 6. Silas nodded slowly. "Perhaps we could arrange alternative payment." His eyes moved to the well shaft. "I understand you have surplus." Maren set the ham down. "I have 207 pounds, she said. "Enough to feed my children through March if I'm careful. Enough to help 3 families who have nothing. Not enough to settle debts with a man who charged double for salt when he knew I had no choice." Silas's face darkened. "That's business." "So is this." Maren picked up the ham. "I will pay what I owe when I can pay. Until then, the meat stays where it is, not in your store, not on your ledger." She walked past him toward the Sandvig claim. Silas watched her go. He would remember this moment in the months to come. He would remember it with particular clarity when families came to him asking not for his credit, but for her instruction. The balance of the county was shifting, and he was on the wrong side of the scale. The children's blizzard of 1888 killed between 200 and 300 people across Dakota Territory and Nebraska. It came without warning on a mild January day and buried the prairie in hours. Families who had prepared survived. Families who had not prepared did not. Maren Halvorsdatter Vangen survived with 207 pounds of preserved meat remaining when the snow finally melted in April. Her children survived. The families she fed survived. She had proven nothing yet except that a desperate idea, executed with discipline, could hold against conditions that had killed better prepared homesteaders across the territory. But survival was only the beginning. By February, the questions started coming. Not mockery now, genuine questions. How deep was the shaft? How long did she brine? What temperature did the lowest shelf hold? Ruth Beck came first, then her husband Johannes, the man with the proper smokehouse that had run empty by January 20th. Then neighbors Maren had never met, traveling from claims 5 and 6 miles away, wanting to know how she had done what everyone said could not be done. Maren answered them all. She showed them the shaft. She explained the candle test, the salt discipline, the shelf arrangement. She shared what Finch had taught her, what she had learned herself, what had worked, and what had failed. The hostile skeptic still owned her debt. The authority skeptic still questioned whether luck had played a larger role than skill. The practical skeptic still wondered if the method would work twice. But on the prairie in February of 1888, Maren Vangen was the woman who had fed her children from a dead well while the blizzard raged above. Whatever came next, that fact would not change. Chunk 2 continues. The thaw came slowly that year. By mid-March, the drifts had receded enough to reveal the damage. The Iverson family had lost their horse, the one they had nearly slaughtered for meat. The Sandvig patriarch would never walk again. 2 children from a claim near Lake Preston had died in a schoolhouse, frozen 10 feet from a stove that had run out of fuel. But the Vangen claim stood. The cow had survived in the buried shelter. The children had grown thin, but not skeletal, and the well had held. Maren did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. She had done arithmetic correctly while others had done it wrong, and the difference between correct and incorrect arithmetic on the prairie was measured in bodies. What she did instead was teach. Ruth Beck returned in the first week of April with a notebook she had borrowed from the school teacher. "Johannes says I'm wasting paper," Ruth said, "but I want to understand how you did it, not just what you did, how you thought about it." Maren led her to the well. The shaft still held temperature better than the open air, though the differential had narrowed as spring approached. The lowest shelf read 44 degrees. The meat that remained, perhaps 40 pounds now, after months of feeding multiple families, showed no degradation beyond what she had trimmed in January. Start with the brine, Myron said. Everything else depends on the brine. She showed Ruth the egg test. She explained the ratios Finch had taught her: how much salt per pound of meat, how long to hold the cure, how to know when penetration was complete. She demonstrated the candle test for airflow. She described the shelf arrangement: upper for drying, middle for transition, lower for storage. Ruth wrote everything down. "This is more than smoking," Ruth said when Marin finished. "This is management, like running a business." "It is running a business. The business is keeping children alive." Ruth looked at the shaft, at the rope arrangement, at the thermometer hanging from its cord. "Johannes has a root cellar," she said. "Not as deep as this, but deeper than most. Could we adapt it?" "Show me and I'll tell you." They rode to the Beck claim that afternoon. Marin examined the cellar, a timber-lined pit 8 feet deep with a dirt floor and a single entrance. The temperature differential was smaller than the well, but the principles were the same. "You cannot smoke in here," Marin said. "The ventilation is wrong and the timber would catch, but you can store. If you cure and smoke above ground first, then transfer the finished meat down here, it will hold better than your attic." "How long?" "Through winter, if you salt correctly. Through spring, if you keep the entrance sealed against heat." Ruth wrote that down too. By the time Marin left, she had promised to return when the Becks butchered in autumn. She would supervise the first batch. She would help them understand what she had learned. It was the first of many such promises. August Tollefson came in late April. He arrived with his freight wagon, moving slower than usual. The winter had aged him. His hands, which had always been steady on the reins, now trembled when he lifted them. "I've been thinking," August said, "about what you built." They stood at the well mouth. The shaft was empty now, the last of the stores consumed in March, but the structure remained: the pulley, the crossbeam, the lid with its hay insulation. "I hauled freight for 6 winters," August said. "I saw families die because they trusted the railroad. I saw families die because they trusted the weather. I told myself I knew what survival required." He paused. "I told you that you would fail." "You told me what you believed." "I believed wrong." August looked at the shaft. The shape of this thing, a hole in the ground, looked like foolishness, but the shape is not what matters. What matters is what the hole does. "Holds temperature," Marin said. "Protects from swings." "Yes, that." August turned to face her. "When I was sheltering with the Iversons during the blizzard, I thought about you. I thought—" "She is dead by now. Her children are dead. The well was a grave, and she fell into it." "I considered the same possibility." August almost smiled. "But you went down the shaft anyway, in the blizzard, while the wind was trying to kill you. The meat was down there. The children were up here. The math was simple." August shook his head slowly. "The math is never simple. You made it simple because you had already done the work." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This is what I owe you for the ham you sent to the Iversons. Market rate, not charity." Marin opened the pouch. $3 in smaller coins. "I told you I did not expect payment." "I know, but payment is how I acknowledge I was wrong, without saying the words more than once." August climbed back onto his wagon. "I will tell other freighters what you built. Some will listen, most will not. But the ones who listen might survive the next blizzard that no one sees coming." He drove away. Marin weighed the coins in her palm. They were enough to settle half her debt with Silas Prune. She pocketed them and returned to work. The Finch letter arrived in May. It came through the De Smet post office, routed through Kansas and 2 relay stations. The handwriting was shaky, not the precise script Marin remembered from the notes Finch had left her. "Dear Mrs. Vangen," the letter read, "I write from a bed I will likely not leave. The winter took what remained of my constitution. I do not say this for sympathy. I have lived longer than most men and more usefully than many. I say it because you should know that the thermometer I left you was my father's, and his father's before him. It has measured temperature on 3 continents. It should continue to measure temperature on a 4th. Keep it. Use it. Teach others to use it. That is the only inheritance I leave anyone. Do not waste it on sentiment." E. F. Finch. Marin read the letter 3 times. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury, and the spring planting would not wait. But she held the thermometer that evening, feeling the weight of it in her palm, and she understood something about inheritance that her father had tried to teach her when she was too young to understand. Knowledge passes. Objects pass. The person who held them does not pass in the same way. They become the knowledge, become the object, become the hands that use what they left behind. Finch had not saved her. She had saved herself. But Finch had shown her how to see what she was already doing. That was worth more than rescue. That was worth everything. Summer brought new problems. The meat was gone by July. The wells stood empty, curing only air. Marin turned her attention to the fall, the butchering season, the curing season, the season when everything she had learned would need to work again. But summer also brought visitors. Johannes Beck wanted to understand the smoking pot. He had tried to build one from Marin's description and failed. The proportions were wrong. The vent collar did not draw. He arrived with the broken remnants and asked if she could show him how. The Sandvig family, the one whose patriarch had lost his feet, sent their eldest son, a boy of 15 named Harold. He wanted to learn the brine ratios. He wanted to understand why some cuts held and others spoiled. He wanted to take the knowledge back to his mother, who now ran the claim alone while his father lay in a bed he might never leave. Old Mrs. Lindquist, a widow from a claim near Spirit Lake, heard through the freight gossip that Marin Vangen knew something about underground preservation. She arrived on foot, having walked 11 miles, and asked only one question. "Can you teach me enough to survive one winter alone?" Marin taught them all. She taught Johannes Beck to shape the smoking pot with the vent collar positioned for draw, not blockage. She taught Harold Sandvig the salt ratios and the floating egg test. She taught Mrs. Lindquist the basic principles: dig deeper, pack the seams, monitor temperature, respect the physics. Each teaching sharpened her own understanding. Each question forced her to articulate what she had learned through trial. Each failure, because the learners failed as she had failed, showed her where the method was fragile and where it was strong. By August, she had taught 11 families some version of what Finch had taught her. And then the second crisis came. The communal butchering happened in the last week of August. 4 families pooled their livestock for a single slaughter, more efficient than 4 separate operations, easier to portion when no family had enough to justify full processing alone. The arrangement had worked for 2 years before the blizzard. This year, Marin was asked to supervise the curing. Finch was dead. She was alone. The first 3 days went smoothly. The slaughter produced nearly 800 pounds of meat, more than Marin had ever processed. The brining vats held. The salt supplies were adequate. The weather cooperated, staying cool enough to prevent spoilage before the cure could take hold. On the 4th day, the temperature spiked. Marin woke to air that felt like July. The thermometer read 74 degrees at dawn. By noon, it would climb past 80. The cure batches, which needed to hold below 50 degrees for another 2 days, were sitting in tubs that would warm to dangerous levels within hours. The families panicked. "Move everything underground," Thomas Lindgren said. He was the largest landholder of the group, and he was wrong. "The cellars will hold." "The cellars are not cold enough," Marin said. "And the meat is not ready. If we move it now, the salt has not penetrated. The cores will spoil before the outside seal." "Then what do we do?" Marin looked at the vats. 400 pounds of meat in active cure, vulnerable to a temperature swing that no one had predicted. She had no Finch to consult. She had no time to test. She had only what she had learned. "Ice," she said. "We need ice." "There is no ice in August." "There is if we dig." Marin turned to Harold Sandvig. "Your father's claim has the deepest cellar in the county. How cold is the floor?" "I don't know. Cold." "Then we run. Now." They found what they needed 2 feet below the Sandvig cellar floor. A layer of frozen earth that had not thawed since the previous winter. The layer was thin, perhaps 8 inches, but it existed. The depth had protected it from summer heat. Marin organized a relay. The men dug. The children carried. The women packed the frozen chunks around the brining vats, creating an improvised cold room in a barn that should have been too warm to hold anything. By nightfall, the temperature in the barn had dropped to 52 degrees. By the next morning, the cure was holding. The meat had not spoiled. Marin sat outside the barn as the sun rose, exhausted in a way she had not felt since January. Ruth Beck brought her water. "Finch would have known to check for frozen ground," Marin said. "I should have known." "You did know," Ruth said. "You figured it out when it mattered." "I guessed." "You tested. That's what he taught you, isn't it? Test, measure, adjust." Ruth sat down beside her. "I watched you this week. The others listened because they trust you. Not because you know everything, because you admit what you don't know, and then you find out." Marin said nothing. "That's rarer than expertise," Ruth said. "Any fool can memorize a method. It takes something else to adapt when the method breaks." The communal butchering finished successfully. 400 pounds of meat entered the curing process. 368 pounds emerged properly preserved and were divided among the families. The loss rate, 8%, was lower than any previous year. Marin did not celebrate, but she allowed herself a small measure of pride. If you know someone who believes that preparation and adaptation matter more than luck, share this story with them, because Marin's work was just beginning, and what she built next would outlast her. Silas Prune's resistance lasted until October. He had watched the summer with growing unease. The families who had visited Marin, who had learned from her, who had adapted their cellars and purchased her salt recommendations, these families were no longer coming to him for emergency supplies. They were no longer running up accounts they could not pay. They were no longer vulnerable in the way that made his business profitable. He tried to undercut her. "I can sell you a patent storage plan," he told the Anderson family in September. "Proven method, works anywhere. $10 for the specifications." The Andersons looked at his drawings, copied badly, from what he had glimpsed of Marin's arrangement, and laughed. "Marin Vangen taught us for free, mister," Anderson said. "And hers actually works." Silas's plans sold to 2 families. Both failed within weeks. The vents were wrong. The depths were insufficient. The salt ratios came from guesswork, not testing. By October, Silas had lost more customers to his own incompetence than Marin had ever cost him. He arrived at the Vangen claim on the 14th with a different expression than any she had seen before. Not contempt, not calculation. Something closer to exhaustion. "I owe you an accounting," Silas said, "of what I tried to do." Marin waited. I copied your method. I sold it badly. I told myself it was business, but it was spite. He stood in the yard where August Tollefson had once predicted her failure. The families who bought my plans lost meat. The Hendrickson boy got sick from spoiled pork. His mother blames me. She's right to blame me. Why are you telling me this? Silas looked at his hands. Because I need to buy cured meat from you. Not for myself, for the store. The shipments from Brookings are delayed. If I don't have stock by November, I lose the freighters who stop here for supply. If I lose the freighters, I lose the store. Marin considered the man who had called her well a meat grave, the man who had charged double for salt, the man who had planned to buy her claim when she failed and had instead watched her succeed. I can spare 40 pounds, she said, at fair market price, not the price you charged me. Silas winced. That's reasonable. I have one condition. Name it. You bring lumber to 3 families who cannot afford it, the Lindquists, the Sandvigs, the Halversons, enough for each to build a small smoking structure. You deliver it yourself. You charge them nothing. Silas stared at her. That's nearly $50 in materials. Yes, that's my condition. He stood in the October cold for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. 40 pounds at fair market, he said. Lumber to 3 families, free delivery. They shook hands. Marin did not trust him. She would never trust him. But she understood something about Silas Prune that his defeat had made clear. He was small in the way that certain men are small, built for advantage rather than contribution. His conversion was not moral, it was economic. He had lost, and losing had made him compliant. That was enough. Compliance could be useful even when trust was impossible. Jonas Eide arrived in November. He was 34 years old, widowed 2 years earlier in Minnesota, and traveling west for reasons he explained plainly. His wife had died in childbirth, the child with her, and the house they had built together had become unbearable. He stopped at the Vangen claim because the pulley mechanism was visible from the road. That's unusual engineering, Jonas said. He was a blacksmith by trade, and he noticed metalwork the way Marin noticed temperature. The crossbeam is overbuilt. The pin joints are amateur, but the concept is sound. The pin sheared last October, Marin said. I replaced it with wagon hardware. Wagon hardware will shear again. The stress point is wrong. Jonas walked to the well and examined the pulley. May I? Marin hesitated. She had learned to distrust men who examined her work, but Jonas's hands moved with professional attention, not condescension. If I reinforced the pin housing and added a secondary bearing, this would last 10 years instead of 1, Jonas said. Might cost you $3 in materials, a day of labor. I have $2. Jonas looked at the well, at the house, at the children watching from the doorway. $2 and a meal, he said. I haven't eaten properly in a week. He stayed for the meal. He stayed for the evening. He stayed for the night, sleeping in the animal shelter with the cow and the hogs she had acquired since the blizzard. The next morning, he began work on the pulley. Marin watched him through the window while she prepared breakfast. His movements were precise. He measured twice, cut once, heated metal in a portable forge he carried in his wagon. By noon, the pulley housing had a new pin, a secondary bearing, and a smooth action that made hauling feel effortless. You did not have to do this, Marin said. I did not have to do anything, Jonas replied. That's the benefit of having nothing. Every choice becomes voluntary. He left that afternoon, but he returned in December with a hoist frame design he said he had been thinking about. The current arrangement forces you to pull straight up, Jonas explained. If I build a pivoting arm, you can swing the load away from the shaft before lowering. Less strain, fewer accidents. Why do you care about my well? Jonas set down his drawings. Because it works. Because no one else I've met on this prairie has built something that works. He paused. And because the children in the doorway remind me of children who did not get to grow up. He built the hoist frame over the winter. It was not courtship, not exactly. There were no flowers, no formal words, no asking permission from family who did not exist. It was collaboration. It was shared work. It was two people who had each buried a spouse finding that they could build something useful together. By the spring of 1889, Jonas had a room in the house and a stake in the claim. By the summer, he had asked Maren a question she had not expected to hear again. She said yes. The wedding was small, Ruth Beck and August Tollefson as witnesses, the minister from De Smet, the children confused but not unhappy. Jonas moved his forge to the property. Maren continued teaching what she knew. They were not a love story in any romantic sense. They were a partnership built on survival, competence, and the mutual recognition that the prairie did not care about sentiment. It cared about whether you could adapt. They could adapt. Together. The 1890s brought changes Maren had not anticipated. The railroad reached De Smet reliably now, bringing supplies that made winter less deadly for everyone. Families who had learned from Maren still used her methods, but the urgency had faded. Underground storage became one option among many, not the desperate necessity it had been in '88. Her system evolved with the times. Jonas improved the mechanical components, better pulleys, stronger frames, a ventilation collar that could be adjusted without descending the shaft. Maren refined the teaching, producing written guides that Ruth Beck copied and distributed through the county school. By 1893, 12 families in Kingsbury County used some version of her method. Not all of them had wells, some had adapted cellars, some had dug dedicated pits, some had built hybrid structures that combined underground storage with above-ground smoking. The principle mattered more than the specific implementation. Control temperature. Respect the physics. Test before trusting. Her children grew. Kirsten became a school teacher in De Smet, known for her patience with students who struggled. Eric took over the claim's daily operations when Jonas's back gave out in '96. Both of them knew how to read a thermometer, mix a brine, and recognize the signs of spoilage before it spread. The hostile skeptic Silas Prune sold his store in 1892 and moved to Sioux Falls, where he opened a smaller operation that never quite succeeded. The last Maren heard of him, he was working as a clerk in someone else's establishment, counting inventory for a wage. The authority skeptic, August Tollefson, died in the winter of '91, hauling freight one last time because he could not imagine stopping. He was found frozen on his wagon seat, 3 miles from town, the reins still in his hands. Maren attended his burial. She did not speak, but she remembered what he had said after the blizzard. I judged by the shape of the thing instead of what it could hold. The practical skeptic, Ruth Beck, became Maren's closest friend and collaborator. Together, they taught a generation of Kingsbury County families to think about food preservation as physics rather than luck. Ruth outlived Maren by 8 years and kept teaching until her own hands could no longer hold a pen. Maren Halverstatter Vangen Eide died in March of 1917, aged 59. The cause was pneumonia, complicated by a heart weakened over decades of labor. She had seen electricity come to De Smet, automobiles replace horses, and a new generation grow up without understanding how close their parents had come to starvation. Her last winter, she asked Jonas to help her down to the well one more time. The shaft was shallower now. They had filled the lowest section when the water table rose in '03, but the principles were the same. The air still cooled as she descended. The walls still held temperature. The thermometer Finch had left her, now cracked and recalibrated twice, still measured what mattered. I used to think survival was the point, she told Jonas when he pulled her back up, getting through the winter, keeping the children alive. But survival is only the beginning. What comes after, that's what matters. What comes after? Maren looked at the prairie, at the claim they had built together, at the neighbor's smoke rising from a curing pit her instructions had helped design. Passing it forward, she said. Everything I learned, everything Finch taught me, everything my father showed me when I was too young to understand, it only matters if it keeps going, if it reaches the next person, if it becomes their knowledge instead of just mine. She died 3 weeks later in the bed where she had nursed her children through fevers, held her husband through nightmares about the blizzard, and finally closed her eyes. Jonas buried her beside Nels on the claim they had all shared. August Tollefson had crossed 6 Dakota winters by 1887. He had seen families fail, claims collapse, children freeze 10 feet from stoves that had run out of fuel. He had earned the right to predict who would survive and who would not. He looked at Maren Vangen's half-finished claim, her $18, her 2 children, her dry well, and he rendered his verdict. If you trust children to that hole, they will eat smoke in November and snow in January. He was half right. They did eat smoke in November, smoked venison, smoked pork, smoked fish that Maren had cured and stored in the shaft while the autumn wind turned cold. They ate smoke all through December, while the first snows came and the temperature dropped and the families who had laughed at her began to count their dwindling stores. But they did not eat snow in January. On January 12th, 1888, when the children's blizzard slammed into eastern Dakota territory with killing speed, Maren Vangen descended into the dead well with a rope tied to her waist and hauled up preserved meat for her children, for the Beck boy who appeared half frozen at her door, for August Tollefson himself when the man who had predicted her failure arrived hungry and humbled. She fed a family from a dead well. And because of that, they saw spring,